to say that parts of our regulatory framework and our laws are a circus act is actually an understatement.
Yes.
You tell the story of the lithography of two circus companies. What was the inherent issue in that situation, and why was copyright a big deal that had to be adjudicated?
Well, that happened a few years before the 1909 reform, and in fact, the 1909 reform refers back to that particular case.
Okay.
Yes, there were traveling circuses traveled around America and had printers print big posters, thousands of them, ranging in size from little leaflets to great billboards, and it was. They were coloured posters for the most part, and it was the biggest part of the whole business of the lithographing industry in the United States at that time. And one circus, called the Wallace Circus, ran out of posters when it was somewhere on tour in the Mideast, and contracted another printer, a different printer from the original one, to run off a few thousand more for its next publicity campaign.
Sure.
And the original printer of those designs, one of whose staff members had designed the things, sued them for copyright infringement, claimed that the copyright in those original posters lay with the company that produced them.
Sure.
And again, he won. And that, you might say, is the forerunner of that paragraph 62 in the 1909 Act, where it's formally established that
a company could be
the author is the company.
Yeah,
yeah, which is an abuse of the language. I mean, whatever you want to do to protect companies and their businesses, it's just not true to say that the employer of an artist is an artist.
Sure. Well, I think the other problem is, thinking back to Solomon, right? There's nothing new under the sun, and he talked a lot about his life. Well, we're not talking about your life, David. We're not talking about my life. We're talking about corporate lives, which are far longer than human lives, and therefore,
can be, yes. Sometimes they're a lot shorter.
Sometimes they can be. But by the way, particularly here in America, we find ways to create short run companies in some cases. But I only pointed out because I think the flip side has to be accounted for, which is the public good. And you discuss in the book what literacy rates did from like 1780 to 1880, and you directly point towards what had happened in the proliferation of what I'll call great works of the world and antiquity and those writings being published more often. Can you teach our listeners, what literacy did and therefore why these books in the public good were so effective?
The reasons for the rise in literacy is something I can't really comment on, except that it was the great tide of history.
Sure.
People learned to read. They learned to read partly because printed matter was becoming cheaper. It was becoming cheaper because of the mechanization of printing presses. It was becoming cheaper because of the invention of cheaper ways of making paper. But I think that this tide would have moved forward, perhaps more slowly, but it would have moved forward all the same. That was the drift of history in that modern period. So, you have to sort of think that, well, through the 19th century, most readers of new books were new readers. That's to say, they had learned to read, and not necessarily at school. And a country like America, but also Britain and France, they wanted more literate readers, literate citizens. Literate citizens could vote. And if they could vote, surely they ought to be able to read and educate themselves. And so there was a conjoining interest of promoting education and promoting books, and therefore also producing a regulatory framework in which it was possible and profitable for people to write books and newspapers. So it really is, it's the century of the triumph of the book and of print matter. By the end of the 19th century, pretty much all what you might call now developed countries were close to 100% literate.
Sure.
And literacy became increasingly a basic requirement for leading the life of a citizen. I mean, you had to fill in forms. It became more bureaucratic kind of society. So in that period, the beneficiaries of intellectual property rights were, well, for a large part, national heroes. They were great writers. They were prominent figures. They were also politicians. Many politicians were writers. Disraeli was a novelist. And the system, bit by bit, stumblingly and clumsily, but nonetheless sort of irresistibly, became internationalized, except for the United States, which stayed out of international arrangements for as long as it possibly could.
Yeah, now you talk about the history of the Red Cross. You talk about the history of what began as kind of patchwork agreements between France and Belgium, and then eventually, was born into what you refer to as the Berne Convention of 1886. Who was involved in that initially? How many countries now comprise that? And why was the United States so late to that game?
The United States, I'll begin with the last question. The United States
easier part.
Was late to that game for a very simple reason. It was a young country. It wanted to educate its growing immigrant population, and it wanted cheap books. And most of the books that it wanted cheap were actually written and published in Britain for the English language, but also in France and Germany and Italy.
Sure.
And it was much simpler for the United States to say, we can't be bothered with international. We haven't got anything to sell yet, though in fact it did. There were many American writers who were immensely famous in Europe, like Harriet Beecher Stowe and Fenimore Cooper. But the view of the United States was that only American citizens were entitled to copyright protection.
Sure.
And that remained that way for a very long time. So back to Berne and the Red Cross. Well, I mentioned the Red Cross simply because it's the first truly multilateral international voluntary organization ever founded in the world.
Sure.
And it provided a model on which the Berne Convention was based. That's to say, signatories to the Red Cross simply obliged to committed themselves to obliging by a general set of rules without obliging any of those member states to change their own laws.
Sure.
And that was the model that Berne took. It was a voluntary convention coming together of countries that would that agreed to certain basic standards in the way they treated each other mutually, but they didn't have to change any domestic laws in order to sign the convention. So that's the relevance of the Red Cross, and the other relevance is why the Berne Convention was held in Switzerland. That's because Switzerland had already become the sort of recognized home of international cooperation and neutrality.
Yeah. You'd also pointed out that Russia joined that really late, like the United States did. And I at first, when you said the Russian system of patronage was bizarre, and you explained that through the AK-47, obviously Kalashnikov's fame. I love that story, so I'd love you to share that. But I actually walked away agreeing with you that the way we state administrate these reminds me a lot more like Russia here in the United States than I would have assumed from the outset.
Please don't say Russia. The Kalashnikov story is a story of the Soviet Union.
Really, sure. Yeah, of Soviet fame. Yeah.
Russia didn't join the Berne Convention prior to the revolution.
Sure. For
quite different reasons, but similar to those of America. The Russian upper classes were completely francophone, and they thought that their theatres would collapse if they had to pay royalties to French authors.
Sure.
They had some wonderful novelists, but they still mostly read novels from England and France, and they didn't want to pay for the privilege of doing what they'd been always doing. So they stayed aloof from Berne, but they were observers at the convention, but didn't sign up. The Soviet Union was a different kettle of fish, because the Soviet Union sort of abolished private property. almost completely. It had an egalitarian view, but an immense respect for its writers and creators. And it developed quite elaborate systems for making them privileged members of Soviet society, and keeping things in proportion. I mean, if you were a writer who was approved of by the authorities in Soviet Russia and not totally idle and became a member of the Writers' Union, you had a very comfortable standard of living in a way that, the beat poets didn't in America.
Yeah.
There was a system to support them. The Kalashnikov story is just very simple. That's really to do with patent law. And Kalashnikov, produced his engineering tinkering that produced this, an automatic rifle that became, the model of its kind and sold hundreds of millions of copies. And of course, being the Soviet Union, Kalashnikov had no property right in his invention.
Sure.
But he got lots of kudos for it. He got promoted through the ranks. He was given a personal motor car. He was given medals, and perfectly satisfied with his lot as an inventor.
Sure.
And I liken this to many things that happen in supposedly non-Soviet regimes such as our own. The medals you get, the residences you get, the larger offices you get for having contributed to your company's profitability are really quite similar in structure to the ways in which the Soviet Union rewarded both its writers and its inventors.
Sure. When I thought a lot about actually the patent office, so when you send your patent in, they approve your patent or not, right? They don't have to accept your patent. If it is, it gets given a number. And if it's not, it's waiting to be approved. They call it patent pending, as we all know. And I thought about it as, does it make any sense for the state to administrate a yes or no system? That seems like, to your point on the Soviet system, you'd be picking winners and losers based on what you think's right, and you might not be right to make those decisions. So I actually asked myself the question, coming from the investment business perspective, should we actually have like a self-regulatory organization that just admits that it was entered into the register, and therefore it still can be adjudicated in courts, but the courts would decide the rights and wrongs rather than the patent office saying yes or no? Because at least it's more of an open market system that's not administered by the state, which a Soviet system is, always the state is first.
I don't know the answer to that. It's a little bit outside of my domain, but with patents, to know whether a patent is truly original and is worthy of protection in its own right, surely in most, if not all cases, that takes some very expert advice.
Exactly.
And I don't think that for me, it doesn't really much matter whether it's the Copyright Office or the Patent Office or a court. They're both, all of them would have to be listening to the guys who actually know about this stuff.
Correct. We'll come back to that. Yeah, we'll come back to that. But again,
copyright's quite different.